So you want to fully understand Shadow of the Erdtree. You beat the DLC. You fought Messmer. You killed Radahn for the second time. But you still don't know what the hell just happened. Why was Marika a shaman? Why was Messmer left behind? What was Miquella actually trying to do? And why did he need Radahn as his consort? This DLC didn't just add new content. It rewrote the entire lore of Elden Ring. It explained Marika's past. It revealed Miquella's plan. It showed you the dark side of compassion. By the end of this video, you'll understand the complete story of Shadow of the Erdtree, from the Hornsent's jar rituals to Miquella's ascension to godhood. We're covering the entire lore, the origins, the crusade, Miquella's pilgrimage, and the final battle at the gate of divinity. If you enjoy full lore breakdowns that actually make sense, hit that subscribe button for more. The Land of Shadow is a physical territory that was once the geographic center of the lands between. Before the age of the Erdtree, this realm was an integral part of the continent, but it was physically veiled and hidden by Queen Marika. She cast a massive spectral shroud over the entire region to conceal the bloody atrocities committed during her violent rise to power. This hidden world is where all manners of death and impurity eventually wash up, serving as a metaphysical drain for the world above. It is a place of absolute stagnation, a landscape where the past is preserved in a state of eternal, rotting decay. This veiled realm is physically represented by the Scadutree, a massive twisted tree that acts as the physical shadow of the Erdtree. The Scadutree entwines with a spectral, golden image of the Erdtree, symbolizing the inseparable bond between the two worlds. While the Erdtree represents life and grace, the Scadutree signifies the suppressed, dark reality of Marika's Golden Order. It is a leaking, crumbling structure that sheds fragments of its power across the ash-covered plains. The tree stands as a silent monument to the secrets Marika wished to bury, a physical proof that the light of the Erdtree is built on a foundation of deep shadow. Geographically, the Land of Shadow is a jagged, broken territory that feels disconnected from the natural laws of the lands between. It is filled with jagged cliffs, ancient ruins, and vast, lightless forests that have been forgotten by the sun. The geography itself is a map of Marika's original sins, with every valley and mountain hiding a graveyard or a ruin from the era of her ascension. It is a place where the barrier between life and death is thin, allowing the spirits of the dead to roam the fields in a state of constant, quiet suffering. The realm is a physical cage designed to keep the truth of the Golden Order's origins from ever reaching the ears of the faithful. The concealment of this land was not just an act of geography, but an act of total historical erasure. By hiding the Land of Shadow, Marika effectively removed the evidence of her own biological and spiritual origins. She wanted a world that believed the Erdtree had always been the supreme source of life, without the messy, violent history of the Crucible. The veil acts as a lid on a pressure cooker, holding back the rage and the sorrow of the people who lived there before the crusade began. It is a world of ghosts, where the architecture of the ancients is slowly being swallowed by the growing Scadutree. Ultimately, the Land of Shadow is the graveyard of the Golden Order's reputation. It is the place where the messy parts of divinity were discarded so that Marika could present a perfect golden face to her subjects. The physical link to the lands between remains, but it is a link of shadows and whispers. To enter this realm is to step back in time, to see the raw, unpolished version of Marika's divinity before the grace was applied. It is a land that shouldn't exist in a world of pure light. A physical reminder that for every ounce of gold, there is an equal weight of leaden shadow hidden just out of sight. Before the rise of the Golden Order, the Hornsent were the dominant and sophisticated civilization of the Tower. They inhabited the massive structures of Belurat and Enir-Ilim, ruling over the land of shadow with a theocratic intensity. The Hornsent worshipped the Crucible, which they viewed as the primordial and sacred form of life, where all things were blended together. To them, the growth of horns on the body was not a curse, but a sign of divinity and spiritual proximity to the heavens. They believed that those born with horns were touched by the original current of life, making them the chosen people of their era. The culture of the Hornsent was built around the idea of divine invocation. They were a society of scholars, warriors, and ascetics who sought to reach the gods through severe ritual and physical suffering. They performed elaborate dances like the divine beast lion dance to channel the rage and power of the storms into their warriors. Their architecture was covered in spiraling patterns and horned iconography, reflecting their belief that the spiral was the natural path toward godhood. They were a people of high magic and deep tradition, convinced that their connection to the Crucible made them the rightful masters of the earth. This belief system was the direct antithesis of what Marika would eventually establish. While the Hornsent celebrated the chaotic blending of life, Marika sought to separate and control it. After her ascension, she famously inverted the Hornsent's values, labeling the growth of horns as a horrific curse. The beings we know as omens in the base game are actually the genetic echoes of the Hornsent culture, born with the same sublime horns that the Tower people once revered. By calling them cursed, Marika was effectively declaring the entire history and religion of the Hornsent to be an abomination against her new golden law. The Hornsent society was also highly stratified, with a hierarchy based on the complexity and number of one's horns. At the peak were the sculpted keepers and the grandams, who communicated with the spiritual world and managed the sacred rituals of the Tower. They viewed themselves as the pinnacle of evolution, looking down upon the shamans and other mortal races who lacked the divine signature of the Crucible. This arrogance fueled their horrific treatment of the shaman people, as they believed that the lesser flesh of Marika's kin was only useful as a material for their own spiritual experiments. They were a people of great beauty and even greater cruelty. In the modern era of the game, the Hornsent are a broken and bitter people, reduced to ghosts haunting their own ruined cities. They have been abandoned by the very gods they tried to summon, and their sacred towers are now graveyards. The Hornsent NPC we meet is a physical embodiment of this fall, a man driven by nothing but a cold, obsessive need for vengeance against the Erdtree. Their history is a reminder that in the lands between, the divine is often just a matter of perspective. One age's holy saint is another age's accursed monster, and the Hornsent were simply the first to be crushed by the shifting definitions of Queen Marika. The Hornsent practiced a horrific and industrial ritual in places like Bonny Village and the Belurat jails. They captured the shaman people who were Marika's kin and subjected them to a process designed to create what they called saints. This was not a holy transformation in the spiritual sense, but a physical and violent blending of flesh. The Hornsent would slice the flesh of the shamans and stuff them into massive jars, along with the butchered remains of criminals and sinners. The goal was to force the different fleshes to meld together in the dark, cold jails, eventually producing a saint that was an amalgamation of many lives. This ritual was based on the Hornsent's belief in the Crucible's power to blend all life into a single divine unit. They viewed the shaman's flesh as particularly harmonious, believing it acted as a glue that could bind the disparate parts of the jar together. The process was agonizing and clinical. The jails were kept freezing cold to prevent the meat from rotting, allowing the fermentation of the flesh to take place over years. The spirits we encounter in the jails scream for mercy, begging not to be put into the jars, as they knew that sainthood meant the total erasure of their individual identity in a soup of bloody limbs. The living jars seen in the base game, like Iron Fist Alexander, are the final evolution of this ancient, horrific practice. While the jars in the lands between are often portrayed as kindly or even heroic, their origin is rooted in the systematic torture of Marika's people. The Hornsent believed that by prayers and ritual, they could rebirth a good person or a virtuous saint from the remains of the condemned. This was a form of spiritual engineering, an attempt to take the cycle of death and rebirth into mortal hands. To the Hornsent, the shamans were not people. They were the essential ingredient for their own religious advancement. Marika's people, the shamans, were decimated by this practice. The shaman village was eventually emptied as its residents were hauled away in chains to the jails. The innard meat items found in the DLC describe the convulsing, pinkish-red meat that remains in the jars, haunted by the rancorous spirits of the victims. This was a nightmare of biological horror, a world where your own body was viewed as a raw material for a tower-dwelling elite. The sainthood promised by the Hornsent was a lie built on a foundation of screams, a ritual that Marika would never forget and never forgive. The psychological impact of this ritual cannot be overstated. It was a form of genocide that targeted the very core of a people's dignity. The Hornsent wore caterpillar masks during the ritual to ward off thoughts of doubt or temptation, treating the butchery as a sacred duty. This industrialization of suffering is what eventually drove Marika to her own extreme actions. When she eventually achieved godhood, her golden order was designed to be the exact opposite of the jar ritual, a world where life was separate, clean, and golden. But the jars remained, a silent, bloody reminder of the cost of the Hornsent's divine ambition. Marika was not born as a god in a high cathedral. She was originally a simple shaman woman from the shaman village. This village is located in the hinterlands, a beautiful and flowery valley, hidden away in the land of shadow. The shamans were a peaceful people, often described as holy women or priestesses who performed religious rites and were known for their unique, harmonious flesh. They lived a quiet existence, far from the grand towers of the Hornsent, until the day their world was shattered. Marika's youth was defined by the simple beauty of her home and the subsequent horror of its total destruction. Base game lore often suggests that Marika and the Newman came from outside the lands between, but the DLC clarifies that the shaman village was her true home. It is possible that the Newmen were refugees who settled in the hinterlands eons ago, making Marika a descendant of an otherworldly race, but a native of the land of shadow. When Marika eventually returned to her village after her rise to power, she found it empty and silent. Every single one of her kin had been hauled away by the Hornsent to be processed in the jars. The tragedy of the empty village is the hidden heartbeat of the entire Elden Ring story. The trauma of seeing her entire culture erased by the Tower people became the primary motivation for Marika's entire reign. She didn't seek power for its own sake. She sought to create a world where such suffering was impossible. She wanted to build a golden order where the Crucible's chaotic blending was forbidden and where death itself was removed from the equation. She fueled her divinity with a deep, boiling vengeance against the Hornsent. Her entire empire was a reaction to the jars, a massive golden shield designed to protect a people that were already dead. She was a survivor who turned her grief into a weapon. This origin story recontextualizes Marika as a deeply tragic and vengeful figure. She was the one shaman who escaped, or was perhaps the only successful jar saint who managed to seize the power of a god. The DLC trailer shows her hair becoming a braid during her ascension, a direct link to the shaman hair talisman that describes her village. Even as a god, she remained tied to her shaman roots, planting a small, golden Erdtree in her home village as a silent memorial to her lost kin. It is the only place in the world where Marika's gold feels soft and gentle, rather than absolute and crushing. The original sin of the Hornsent, the jarring of the shamans, is what birthed the Golden Order. Marika's godhood was a response to a genocide, a cycle of violence that she then visited back upon the land of shadow with interest. By understanding her as a shaman, we see that her order was never about justice. It was about safety at any cost. She was a mother who lost her family and decided that the only way to prevent it from happening again was to become the absolute master of reality. The shaman village is the ground zero of the Elden Ring, the place where a peaceful priestess was transformed into the most powerful and terrifying goddess in history. At the absolute peak of the Tower of Enir-Ilim stands the Gate of Divinity, a massive and horrifying ritual site that served as the birthplace of a god. The gate is a towering archway made of the petrified, bloody corpses of thousands of victims, mostly shamans and Hornsent. It is a physical manifestation of the crucible of life energy required to fuel an ascension. To become a god, an Empyrean must cross through this gateway, a process that requires a massive sacrifice of souls to reach the divine realm beyond. The imagery of the gate is a stark contrast to the golden halls of the capital, a bloody and visceral monument to the cost of divinity. Marika's ascension at the Gate of Divinity was a cataclysmic event that reshaped the entire world. The DLC story trailer shows her standing before the gate, pulling gold threads from a bloody mass of flesh. This mass is believed to be the remains of the Jar Saints, or a concentrated vessel of the Crucible. By pulling these threads, Marika was crafting the Elden Ring itself, claiming the power of the greater will through a ritual of total betrayal. This was the moment she transitioned from a shaman saint into a god, a transformation that was violent, chaotic, and fueled by the lives of her enemies. The Gate of Divinity acts as a portal to a realm that lies beyond the physical world, possibly a divine afterlife or the source of the primordial current. To use it, a second condition is often required: a Lord Consort. This consort acts as a physical anchor, a lord who can tether the new god back to the material world so they do not drift away into instability. For Marika, this anchor was likely Radahn or Godfrey, the champions who allowed her new order to take root. The gate is a collector of runes and essence, a vortex that channels the power of the living to create the authority of a god. When Miquella eventually reaches this same gate centuries later, The structure has fossilized into a white, ashen stone, but its purpose remains the same. The gate is the original sin in architectural form. It is the place where Marika betrayed the Hornsent who had betrayed her people. She used their tower, their rituals, and their lives to ascend to a throne that would eventually cast them into shadow. The Gate of Divinity is the most important location in the lore, as it represents the beginning of the Age of Fire and the moment the Land of Shadow was born. The horror of the gate is that it proves godhood is a product of mass death. You cannot become a god in this world without a mountain of bodies to stand upon. Marika's golden order began in a place of dripping blood and petrified screams, a truth she spent the rest of her reign trying to hide. The Gate of Divinity is the backstage of the Elden Ring, the place where the divine sausage is made. It is the ultimate proof that every age of light is bought with a dark, bloody currency, and that Marika's glory was built on the petrified remains of her own tragedy. The Impaler is one of the most tragic and misunderstood figures in the history of the demigods. He is a son of Queen Marika, born long before the twins, Malenia and Miquella, and he was Marika's most loyal commander. Messmer possesses the bright, red hair that links him to Radahn, suggesting he was born from the single god, Union. While his siblings, like Godwyn and Radahn, became legendary figures of the lands between, Messmer was kept a secret. He was a tool of genocide, a hidden son used to do the dirty work of the Golden Order, while the rest of the world remained ignorant of his existence. Messmer was born with a horrific biological curse. The Abyssal Serpent dwells inside him. This ancient, malevolent entity wriggles within his flesh, threatening to consume his very soul. To contain this blasphemy, Marika was forced to pluck out one of Messmer's eyes and replace it with a seal of grace. This seal kept the serpent at bay, but it also marked Messmer as a monster in his mother's eyes. He was a child born of fire and shadow, a being that represented the impure aspects of Marika's lineage. Despite this, Messmer's loyalty to his mother was absolute, a devotion that would eventually lead to his own abandonment. As a military leader, Messmer was terrifying and efficient. He led an army of fire knights on a crusade to exterminate the Hornsent, using a massive great spear to impale his foes. His flame was a unique, dark fire that could burn even the spirits of the dead. He was the cleanup man for Marika's vengeance, tasked with turning the Land of Shadow into a graveyard so that the pure lands between could flourish. He was the elder brother who took on the sins of the family so that his siblings could remain golden. His title, the Impaler, became a name of fear across the Shadow Realm, a symbol of the Golden Order's capacity for total destruction. The tragedy of Messmer is that he was a victim of his own loyalty. He did exactly what his mother asked, clearing the land of graceless beings and maintaining the Veil of Shadow. But once the work was done, Marika had no more use for him. She viewed him as a reminder of the atrocities she wanted to forget. She stopped communicating with him, leaving him to rule a kingdom of ash and corpses for eternity. Messmer spent centuries waiting for a sign from a mother who had already discarded him. He was a soldier who won the war, but was never allowed to come home. A demigod whose very existence was a classified secret. When the player encounters Messmer in the Shadowkeep, he is a figure of profound loneliness and simmering rage. He still wears the seal of grace in his eye, a physical reminder of the mother who betrayed him. He despises the flame that burns within him, yet he uses it to defend his mother's order to his last breath. Messmer is the true shadow of the demigods, the one who bore the weight of the crusade so that the Erdtree could stand tall. He is the ultimate proof of Marika's ruthlessness. She was willing to use her own son as a disposable weapon and then seal him away in a lightless abyss to keep her reputation clean. Under the direct orders of Queen Marika, Messmer led an army of Fire Knights and Black Knights on a crusade of absolute extermination against the Hornsent. This was not a war of territory or politics. It was a war of total religious vengeance. The crusade was the Golden Order's response to the jarring of the shaman people. Messmer's forces marched through the land of shadow, burning cities, destroying temples, and turning the Tower of Bellerad into a massive, ash-filled graveyard. They sought to erase the Hornsent from history, treating them as graceless abominations that had no place in Marika's new world. The military campaign was brutal and industrial. Messmer's Fire Knights used a specialized dark flame to purge the Hornsent's divine beasts and their horned warriors. They didn't just kill the adults, they systematically destroyed the culture of the Tower people, smashing their effigies and burning their sacred trees. The battlefield priests of the crusade even experimented with the Hornsent's own jar rituals, turning the Tower people's horrific technology against them. The land of shadow became a landscape of fire and smoke, a place where the sun was permanently obscured by the soot of 1,000 burning villages. The crusade was a complete and total military victory, but it left the land of shadow in a state of permanent ruin. The once grand civilization of the Hornsent was reduced to a few scattered ghosts and bitter survivors. Messmer's knights established the Shadow Keep as their base of operations, a massive fortress designed to overlook the slaughter and manage the purification of the land. This was a war of holy cleansing, where every act of cruelty was justified by the goal of protecting the Golden Order's purity. The fire of the crusade was meant to burn away the taint of the Crucible, but it left behind a world that was just as cursed and bloody as the one it replaced. The tragedy of the crusade is that it turned the victims of the jar rituals into the perpetrators of a genocide. Marika used her own son to visit the same suffering upon the Hornsent that they had visited upon her village. It was a cycle of revenge that had no end. The Fire Knights, many of whom were once noble warriors, became obsessed with the spirituality of Messmer's flame, losing their own humanity in the process. The crusade didn't bring peace. It brought us peace of the grave. It ensured that the land of shadow would remain a lightless, ash-covered void, hidden away from the rest of the world so that the Golden Order wouldn't have to look at what it had done. By the end of the crusade, the land of shadow was effectively dead. The Hornsent were defeated, their gate of divinity was sealed, and their culture was erased. Messmer had fulfilled his mother's request, but in doing so, he had become a monster that even Marika could no longer stand to look at. The crusade was the final, bloody chapter of Marika's rise to power, the moment she successfully cleaned her history by burying it under a mountain of corpses. It is the defining event of the land of shadow, a war that was won by the sword and then hidden away by a veil of spectral shadow. The Scadutree is the massive, twisted silhouette that dominates the horizon of the land of shadow, acting as the physical and spiritual counterpoint to the golden Erdtree. It is not a separate entity, but rather the shadow cast by the Erdtree itself, a manifestation of the darkness that must exist for the light to shine. The Scadutree appears as two gargantuan trunks entwined in a strangling embrace, leaking a thick, golden-black sap that pools in the valleys below. Unlike the Erdtree, which stands straight and emits a warm radiance, the Scadutree is bent and fractured, shedding Scadutree fragments as its ancient bark slowly crumbles into the void. This tree represents the suppressed, dark reality of the Golden Order and the heavy weight of Marika's past. While the Erdtree is a symbol of life and the continuous cycle of grace, the Scadutree signifies the accumulation of sin and the inevitability of decay. It is the drain of the world, where all the things rejected by the Golden Order, the death, the rot, and the impurities, eventually gather. The Scadutree does not offer blessings to the faithful. It exerts a crushing pressure on the souls trapped beneath it, acting as a constant reminder that the order of the lands between is built upon a foundation of absolute, hidden suffering. The physical state of the Scadutree reflects the mental state of the realm it towers over. It is a tree of ash and sap, struggling to hold itself together even as it withers. The golden sap it produces is not the life-giving dew of the Erdtree, but a heavy, viscous liquid that symbolizes the burden of history. This sap is gathered by the followers of the Shadow, who use it to sustain their unnatural lives in a world where the sun never shines. The Scadutree is a dying god in arboreal form, a structure that is only kept upright by the spectral veil that Marika cast over the land to hide her original crimes. Metaphysically, the Scadutree is the proof that the Golden Order is a system of disparity, much like the ages that came before it. You cannot have absolute gold without creating an equal amount of shadow, and the Scadutree is where that shadow was deposited. It is the destination for the graceless, the beings who were stripped of their light and cast out of the Erdtree's protection. By veiling the land of shadow, Marika didn't just hide a territory. She tried to hide the very concept of shadow itself, attempting to trick the world into believing that the light could exist in a vacuum without any consequences or darkness. The Scadutree is also the ultimate goal for many of the characters who journey into the Shadow Realm. Its fragments provide the only way for the player to gain strength in this hostile territory, forcing the Tarnished to consume the very essence of the shadow to survive. It is a tree that demands sacrifice and acknowledgement of the dark. As the world of Elden Ring moves toward its conclusion, the Scadutree remains as a haunting, broken monument to the fact that the Erdtree's grace was always a temporary mask. The shadow was always there, entwined with the gold, waiting for the day the veil would finally be torn away. Inside the body of Messmer, the Impaler dwells a base serpent, a primordial and malevolent entity that acts as a living curse upon his soul. This is not a creature he chose to carry, but a biological part of his heritage, likely inherited through the chaotic nature of the Crucible during his birth. The serpent is a mass of winged, writhing snakes that eat away at Messmer's internal light, filling his body with an insatiable, abyssal fire. This entity is considered the ultimate blasphemy against the Erdtree, as the serpent has long been the symbol of the traitor and the unclean in the mythology of the Golden Order. Messmer spent his entire existence in a state of constant, agonizing struggle to keep this serpent contained. To protect her son and the purity of her order, Marika performed a ritual of shedding on Messmer, plucking out his eye and replacing it with a seal of grace. This seal acted as a spiritual plug, holding back the abyssal energy and preventing the serpent from fully manifesting and consuming the land. Messmer's life was defined by this suppression. He had to maintain a rigid, nightly discipline to ensure that the monster inside him remained asleep. He was a cage of gold, holding back a tidal wave of dark, squirming snakes. When the player pushes Messmer to his limit in the Shadowkeep, he finally shatters the seal in his eye, choosing to embrace the blasphemy to defend his mother's kingdom. The transformation is horrific. Messmer's flesh falls away, and he becomes a colossal, winged serpent of dark flame, striking with a speed and ferocity that is entirely inhuman. In this form, he is no longer a prince of the Erdtree, he is a lord of the abyss. This reveal proves why Marika was so terrified of her son. Messmer wasn't just a commander, he was a walking end-of-the-world scenario, a being whose very nature threatened to dissolve the Golden Order into chaos. The Abyssal Serpent is also linked to the traitors of the ancient world, specifically the Serpent of the Volcano Manor. It represents a base form of life that refuses to be ordered or categorized by the grace of the gold. It is the raw, predatory hunger of the primordial world. By carrying this serpent, Messmer became a bridge between the Golden Order and the ancient, dark powers that existed before the Erdtree. He was a monstrosity by design, a child who inherited the sins of the Crucible that Marika was trying so hard to bury. The serpent was the physical proof that Marika could not fully purge the messy parts of life from her own bloodline. The ultimate tragedy of Messmer's curse is that it made him a pariah in his own family. Despite his absolute loyalty and his success in the crusade, he could never be allowed to sit on a throne in the capital. The Abyssal Serpent made him a biological liability. He was the son who was too dark to be seen, used for his strength but despised for his blood. When he dies, the serpent dies with him, and the abyssal fire finally goes out. Messmer's death is a release from a lifelong prison of scales and fangs, a final end to the base entity that had been devouring him from the inside since the day he was born. Once the Hornsent were broken, the towers were burned, and the land of shadow was safely veiled behind its spectral shroud, Queen Marika committed her final and most cold-hearted act. She abandoned the realm and everyone in it. She returned to the lands between to rule as a god, but she left behind her son, Messmer, and his entire army of knights. She ceased all communication with the Shadow Realm, effectively ghosting the people who had fought her bloodiest war. This was not a tactical withdrawal, but a total betrayal of the very people who had secured her divinity. She wanted the clean result of the crusade, without having to deal with the dirty soldiers who won it. Messmer's tragedy is defined by this abandonment. He was a son who worshipped his mother with a religious intensity, yet he was left to rot in a kingdom of ash and corpses for eternity. He remained in the Shadowkeep, faithfully carrying out his orders, even though no new orders ever came. He spent centuries staring at the veiled sky, waiting for a sign or a word of gratitude that would never arrive. His loyalty was his greatest strength and his ultimate curse. He couldn't stop being a soldier, even when his commander had already forgotten his name. He was the guardian of a graveyard, ruling over a land that Marika had officially declared dead. The abandonment extended to the Fire Knights and the Black Knights who served under Messmer. These were once noble warriors of the capital, some of the most skilled fighters in the Golden Order. They were told their crusade was a holy mission, but they eventually realized they were being erased from the history books. They became the Forgotten, men who were no longer allowed to return home, because their very presence was a reminder of the atrocities the Erdtree wanted to hide. They descended into madness and ritual, turning their focus toward the flame of Messmer, because the grace of Marika had clearly turned its back on them. This act of betrayal reveals the true nature of Marika's divinity. She was a goddess of utility. Once a person or a tool had served its purpose, she had no emotional qualms about discarding it. This is a pattern we see throughout the lore, from her treatment of Godfrey to her eventual shattering of the Elden Ring. To Marika, Messmer was a clean-up man, a janitor who dealt with the Hornsent mess so she could have a clean house. Once the house was clean, the janitor was locked in the basement and the key was thrown away. The Land of Shadow is the basement of the Golden Order, filled with the loyal tools that Marika no longer wanted to look at. The abandonment is the reason why the Land of Shadow feels so stagnant and hopeless when the player arrives. It is a world that has been paused in the middle of a genocide. The fires are still smoldering, the knights are still patrolling, and the victims are still screaming, all because Marika never gave the order to stop. She simply walked away and left the engine of destruction running. Messmer's final words to his mother are filled with a heartbreaking realization of this betrayal. He died defending a mother who had already killed him the moment she cast the veil. The abandonment was the final blow of the crusade, the act that turned a military victory into a spiritual tragedy. The ultimate, unalloyed goal. Miquella the Kind, the twin brother of Millennia, entered the Land of Shadow, not for conquest, but for the purpose of divesting himself of his own godhood and humanity. Miquella realized that the Golden Order, established by his mother, was fundamentally broken and rotten at the roots, because it was built on a foundation of exclusion and sin. His ultimate, unalloyed goal was to reach the gate of divinity and become a new kind of god, one who would start the age of compassion. He believed that by shedding his flesh, his great rune, and his very heart, he could become a pure, impartial entity capable of healing the world's suffering through a global embrace of love. Miquella's vision for the world was one where no one was left behind. He wanted to include the Hornsent, the Omens, the Misbegotten, and the Albinaurics, all the groups that Marika's Golden Order had deemed graceless or unclean. This was a direct ideological challenge to his mother's legacy. Miquella believed that order didn't have to be a system of control and hierarchy. It could be a system of universal acceptance. He sought to become a god who ruled through kindness rather than through the sword. However, as his pilgrimage progressed, it became clear that this kindness had a dark, compulsory edge that threatened the free will of every being in the lands between. The journey to the Gate of Divinity was a systematic process of self-destruction. Miquella understood that as long as he carried the blood and the vices of his parents, he would be doomed to repeat their mistakes. Therefore, he began to literally peel himself apart. He abandoned his physical body, his strength, and even his ability to feel doubt or fear. He wanted to be a blank slate, a perfect vessel for a new world order. This was the ultimate unalloyed experiment, an attempt to create a divinity that was entirely free from the impurities of the past. He was a boy who wanted to save the world by deleting everything about himself that made him human. Miquella's goal was also driven by his desperate love for his sister, Millennia. He spent his entire life trying to cure her scarlet rot, but every attempt within the Golden Order failed. He realized that as long as the outer gods, like the Greater Will or the Rot God, had influence over the world, Millennia would never be free. His pilgrimage was a search for a sovereign power that could override the influence of these cosmic entities. He wanted to create a haven for the broken, and he believed that the only way to do that was to seize the throne of the heavens and rewrite the laws of reality from scratch. Ultimately, Miquella the Kind represents the most dangerous kind of ambition, the ambition of the righteous. He was so convinced that his age of compassion was the only way to save the world that he was willing to sacrifice everything, including his own soul, to achieve it. He didn't want to be a tyrant like Marika, but he ended up following the exact same path of abandonment and manipulation. His kindness became a cage, and his compassion became a chain. Miquella's story is a warning that even the most noble goals can turn into a nightmare if they are pursued through the systematic erasure of the self and the manipulation of the hearts of others. The concept of unalloyed gold was Miquella's first major act of rebellion against the Golden Order and the fundamentalism of his father, Radahn. Miquella was a genius child who initially studied the laws of the Erdtree with great fervor, but he quickly found them lacking. The Golden Order was a fundamentalist system that relied on rigid logic and the exclusion of the unpure. When Miquella realized that these holy laws could not stop the scarlet rot eating his sister, or his own curse of eternal childhood, he abandoned the Erdtree entirely. He began to craft unalloyed gold, a substance designed to ward off the meddling of outer gods and provide a pure, human-centric source of power. Unalloyed gold was more than just a metal. It was a spiritual philosophy of self-sufficiency. It represented Miquella's belief that life didn't need the grace of a distant, uncaring god to flourish. By using unalloyed gold needles, Miquella was able to temporarily halt the rot and provide protection against the frenzy and the darkness that plagued the world. This was a direct insult to the greater will, as Miquella was essentially saying that he could build a better, safer world without the divine help of the Erdtree. He was the unalloyed prince, the one who sought to strip away the alloys of cosmic influence to find the pure core of reality. In the Land of Shadow, we see the final, extreme evolution of this rejection. Miquella realized that even his unalloyed gold was not enough to fix a world that was already broken at the foundation. He understood that as long as the Elden Ring existed as it was, the cycle of suffering would continue. This led him to the conclusion that he had to abandon not just the Golden Order, but the very concept of order itself as understood by his family. He sought to replace the gold with compassion, a force that would bind the world together through a mental and spiritual connection rather than through a physical ring of power. Miquella's rejection of the Golden Order also meant a rejection of his own divine lineage. He viewed his parents as the architects of a failed experiment. He saw his father, Radahn, as a man obsessed with totality, and his mother, Marika, as a woman obsessed with vengeance. By abandoning the gold, Miquella was attempting to purify his own destiny. He wanted to be a god who was unalloyed by the sins of his house. This was a lonely and difficult path, as it required him to discard the very sources of power that made him a demigod in the first place. He was trading his golden inheritance for a shadow pilgrimage. Ultimately, unalloyed gold serves as a symbol of Miquella's intellectual and spiritual independence. It was the bridge that led him from being a prince of the capital to being a pilgrim of the shadow. It showed his willingness to experiment, to doubt, and to move beyond the comfort of the established religion. However, the tragedy of the unalloyed gold is that it was ultimately a temporary fix. It could stall the rot, but it couldn't cure the world. This failure is what eventually drove Miquella to the gate of divinity, leading him to believe that the only way to truly unalloy the world was to become a god and force it to be pure. The method by which Miquella entered the Land of Shadow is one of the most calculated and dark acts of his entire career, involving the manipulation and death of the Lord of Blood, Mohg. In the base game, it appeared that Mohg had kidnapped Miquella from the Erdtree to start his own Mohgwyn dynasty. However, the DLC reveals a much more disturbing truth. Miquella charmed Mohg into kidnapping him. Miquella needed a way to shed his physical body and send his soul to the Shadow Realm, and he used Mohg as both a gateway and a future tool for his resurrection. Mohg was not a villain in this scenario. He was a puppet in a much larger, more divine game. To reach the Land of Shadow, a person must effectively die or be cast out of the grace of the Erdtree. Miquella used the cocoon of the Empyrean in Mohg's palace as a ritual site to transition his soul into the Veiled Realm. While his body remained in the cocoon, withered and drained, his spirit was able to cross the barrier and begin his pilgrimage. He needed Mohg's connection to the formless mother and the unclean blood to bypass the Golden Order's protections. Miquella used the most vile demigod as his secret ladder to heaven, proving that his kindness was not above using the lives of his family members for his own ends. Miquella's interest in Mohg was not just about the gateway. He also needed Mohg's physical body for the final stage of his plan. Miquella's secret rite required a vessel to house the soul of his chosen consort. Because Mohg was an omen, his body was strong, durable, and possessed the blood flame of the Crucible, the very thing Marika had tried to erase. Miquella intended to take the soul of his promised consort, Radahn, and place it into the surgically prepared and purified body of Mohg. This would create a resurrected champion who possessed Radahn's skill and Mohg's primordial power. Mohg was being farmed for his genetics like a piece of livestock. This revelation completely recontextualizes the tragedy of Mohg. The Lord of Blood was a man driven by a desperate desire for a family and a dynasty, but he was seduced by a kind god who never cared for him at all. Miquella used Mohg's love and his impure blood to fuel a journey toward a pure age. It is a staggering example of Miquella's ruthlessness. He was willing to ruin the reputation and the life of his half-brother to secure a path to the gate of divinity. This gateway was built on a foundation of stolen hearts and borrowed bodies, showing that Miquella's new age was being born from the same kind of exploitation as Marika's. By entering the realm through Mohg's palace, Miquella was also making a statement about the inclusivity of his new age. He was literally using the shadow and the unclean to reach the divine. However, the price of this inclusivity was the total destruction of Mohg's agency. Miquella's entrance into the Shadow Realm was an act of divine theft. He stole a life to start a new world. As Miquella's soul began to discard its parts across the gravesite plane, the body of Mohg remained in the palace, a hollowed-out shell that had served its purpose as a door, and would soon serve its final purpose as a suit of skin for a dead general. As Miquella travelled through the Land of Shadow, he left behind a series of Miquella's crosses that act as physical markers of his transformation and his systematic self-destruction. Each cross is a site where Miquella discarded a specific part of his identity, his body, or his lineage. These locations are accompanied by haunting inscriptions. I abandon here my right arm. I abandon here my heart. I abandon here my doubts. These crosses are the breadcrumbs of a god who is literally peeling himself like an onion. They show that Miquella's pilgrimage was not a walk of triumph, but a grueling process of hollowing himself out to become a vessel of pure compassion. The discardment of his physical limbs represents his rejection of the cursed body he was born with. Miquella was cursed with eternal childhood, a body that could never grow or mature. By abandoning his flesh at the crosses, he was attempting to escape the biological limits imposed by his parents. He believed that to rule as a perfect god, he could not have a body that was subject to the laws of nature. Each cross represents a moment where Miquella became less of a person and more of a concept. He was trading his physical presence for a spiritual authority that would eventually span the entire world. The most disturbing crosses are those where he discards his internal, emotional components. At one cross, he abandons his sense of fear, and at another, his doubts. While this might seem like a way to become a stronger leader, it actually highlights the tragedy of his descent. A god who feels no fear and has no doubts is a god who can no longer understand the human experience. By discarding these parts, Miquella was losing his empathy and his ability to self-reflect. He was becoming a machine of kindness, an entity that would push forward with its age of compassion, regardless of the cost or the resistance it encountered. These crosses also serve as a tracking system for his followers and the player. They allow the NPCs, like Leda, Freya, and Ansbach, to follow Miquella's trail, but they also serve as warnings. Ansbach, in particular, begins to realize the horror of what Miquella is doing. He sees the crosses not as signs of holiness, but as signs of a man who is losing his way by losing himself. The crosses are the physical evidence of Miquella's great abandonment. They prove that Miquella's path to divinity required him to become an empty being, a ghost who has left his heart and his history scattered across a ruined landscape. Ultimately, the crosses are monuments to Miquella's absolutism. He was so committed to his vision that he was willing to throw away every single thing that made him Miquella. By the time he reached the gate of divinity, there was almost nothing left of the original boy who loved his sister and built the Erdtree. He was a new god who had left his old self at the crosses. The crosses remain in the land of shadow as silent, golden markers of a tragedy. They show that Miquella's age of compassion was bought at the price of his own humanity, leaving behind a trail of abandoned limbs and broken hearts in the ash. At a critical junction in the story, the player hears the distinct and violent sound of a great rune shattering in the distance. This event marks the moment Miquella the Kind finally casts away his great rune, the celestial fragment that served as his last physical tie to his divine heritage and the Golden Order. This was the ultimate act of divesting the flesh, as Miquella realized that even a sliver of the Elden Ring was a source of impurity that linked him to his mother's broken system. By breaking the rune, Miquella was declaring himself a free agent of reality, no longer bound by the laws of the Erdtree or the influence of the greater will. He was a god in the making, and he refused to carry the baggage of a dying empire. When the great rune breaks, its secondary effect is revealed. The powerful charm that Miquella had placed over his followers and the player is instantly dissolved. This charm was not a simple spell. but a massive mental compulsion that forced everyone in Miquella's presence to feel an overwhelming sense of love and loyalty toward him. The breaking of the rune is a moment of cold, harsh clarity for the NPCs gathered in the Shadow Realm. It reveals that Miquella's kindness was actually a sophisticated form of brainwashing, ensuring that his pilgrimage was never slowed down by the dissent or the free will of others. He had gathered an army of friends by taking away their ability to be his enemies. The psychological fallout among Miquella's followers is immediate and chaotic. Characters like Ansbach and Thiolier suddenly realize that their devotion was an artificial construct, leading to a deep sense of violation and betrayal. Ansbach, a former servant of Morg, discovers that Miquella had used his master as a disposable tool, a realization he could never have reached while the charm was active. The breaking of the rune proves that Miquella's path to divinity was built on a foundation of stolen hearts. He was a boy who wanted to save the world, but he began by enslaving the minds of the very people who were trying to help him. The divestment of the Great Rune also signifies Miquella's transition into a truly impartial god. He believed that to rule the Age of Compassion, he could not have any personal attachments or traditional sources of power. By breaking the rune, he was shedding his ego and his history. However, this divestment also made him terrifyingly absolute. Without the Great Rune to anchor him to the established laws of the world, Miquella became a law unto himself. He was no longer a demigod playing by the rules of the game. He was a prospective deity who intended to rewrite the rules entirely, using his own pure will as the only standard for justice. Ultimately, the Great Rune Break is the reveal of Miquella's true nature. It shows that he is just as manipulative and driven as his mother, Marika, but his methods are wrapped in the language of love rather than the language of war. The shattering of the rune is the death of the prince and the birth of the god. It leaves the player and the followers in a world where kindness has been exposed as a weapon. Miquella's pilgrimage continued toward the tower, but he left behind a group of broken, disillusioned warriors who finally had to choose whether to follow him out of genuine belief or to stop him out of a newfound, justified fear. Part 16, Saint Trina, the abandoned, other half. Saint Trina is revealed to be the other half of Miquella, representing his feminine aspect and his innate capacity for love, sleep, and doubt. Much like Marika and Radahn were two halves of the same divine being, Miquella and Saint Trina shared a single existence for most of their lives. Saint Trina was the soft side of Miquella's divinity, a figure of eternal rest who provided comfort to the troubled and the weary through the power of magical sleep. However, as Miquella's obsession with becoming a perfect god grew, he began to view Saint Trina not as a part of himself, but as an impurity that carried the weight of human emotion and uncertainty. As Miquella descended into the land of shadow, he decided that his heart and his ability to love were hindrances to his grand vision. He believed that a god must be perfectly impartial and unalloyed by the messy feelings that cause conflict. To achieve this, he literally tore Saint Trina out of his own soul and cast her away. He threw her into the stone coffin fissure, a deep and lightless hole at the edge of the southern coast. This was an act of profound self-mutilation. Miquella wasn't just abandoning a person. He was abandoning his own conscience and his own ability to feel the very compassion he claimed to want for the world. When the player finds Saint Trina in the depths of the fissure, she is a tragic and withered sight. She appears as a beautiful, purple flower being, growing out of a mass of putrescent sludge, surrounded by the silence of eternal sleep. She is the discarded love of a god, a being who has been left to rot in the dark because she was too human for Miquella's new age. She communicates through her devoted follower, Tiolier, and her presence is one of deep, crushing melancholy. Saint Trina is the physical evidence of what Miquella had to sacrifice to reach the gate of divinity. He had to kill the part of himself that was capable of truly caring for an individual. The abandonment of Saint Trina proves that Miquella's age of compassion is a hollow promise. You cannot have compassion without a heart, and Miquella left his heart in a stone coffin. Saint Trina represents the doubt that Miquella feared would slow him down. She understood that divinity is not a solution, but a burden that distorts everything it touches. By casting her aside, Miquella was attempting to purify his path, but he only succeeded in making himself a machine of divine will. Saint Trina remains in the dark as a silent witness to her other half's descent into madness, a goddess of sleep who knows that the dream Miquella is building is actually a nightmare. Ultimately, Saint Trina serves as the most important voice of warning in the DLC. She is the only being who truly knows Miquella's soul, and she is the only one who realizes that his success would be a disaster for the world. Her presence in the fissure is a reminder that Marika's children are doomed to repeat her patterns of abandonment. Miquella followed in his mother's footsteps by casting away the parts of himself that he deemed unclean, leaving behind a trail of broken halves and forgotten loves. Saint Trina is the shadow of Miquella's kindness, a tragic figure who begs for the death of the god she once shared a body with. Part 17. The Poison of Love, Saint Trina's Warning. The warning provided by Saint Trina to the player is one of the most significant and chilling moments in the entire lore of the Shadow Realm. Through her nectar and her connection to Tiolier, she delivers a single, devastating message. Godhood is a prison. This warning is a direct critique of Miquella's entire pilgrimage. Saint Trina, having been part of Miquella, understands that the pursuit of divinity is not an act of liberation, but a process of becoming trapped by one's own absolute power. She realizes that a god cannot fix the world, because a god is no longer part of the world. By becoming a deity, Miquella would be locking himself into a role where he must force his will upon reality forever. Saint Trina's warning recontextualizes the age of compassion as a toxic and poisonous love. She explains that Miquella's desire to embrace the world and take away its pain is actually a desire to take away the world's agency. If everyone is charmed into being kind, then kindness no longer has any meaning. It becomes a hollow, mandatory state of being. This poison of love is the idea that Miquella's affection is so absolute that it smothers the life out of the things he loves. He is like a child who squeezes a bird too hard because he wants to keep it safe. Saint Trina begs the player to kill Miquella to prevent him from becoming a pure god, because a god without a heart is a monster. This warning highlights the fundamental difference between Miquella the Kind and Saint Trina of the Sleep. Miquella wants to act and order the world, while Saint Trina understands the value of rest and acceptance. She knows that the suffering Miquella wants to cure is a natural part of the human experience. By trying to delete suffering, Miquella is trying to delete what makes life real. Saint Trina views his plan as a hollow piece, a world of mindless, smiling puppets who have no choice but to love their god. To her, death is a better fate for Miquella than the divine prison he is building for himself at the peak of the tower. The tragedy of Saint Trina is that she still loves Miquella, even after he threw her into the abyss. Her warning is not born of spite, but of a deep, protective sorrow. She wants to save Miquella from himself. She knows that if he succeeds, he will be lonely for eternity. A god who has discarded everything that could have made him happy. Her nectar, which acts as a poison to the player, is a physical metaphor for Miquella's love. It is sweet and alluring, but it leads to a state of total, unconscious submission. St. Trina's warning is a plea for the player to maintain the disparity of the world, even if it means allowing the suffering to continue. Ultimately, St. Trina's message is the final verdict on Miquella's pilgrimage. It confirms that the boy who sought to unalloy the world has accidentally poisoned it with his own ambition. St. Trina remains the only character who truly sees the dark side of Miquella's light. She is the voice of the shadow telling the gold that it is time to stop. Her warning is the anchor that allows the player to resist Miquella's charm and realize that the kind god must be stopped for the sake of the world's free will. She is the heart that Miquella threw away, and her poison is the only thing that can cure his madness. Part 18. The Followers of Miquella. The Charmed War. Miquella's journey into the land of shadow was accompanied by a diverse group of followers, often called the Needle Knights, led by the fanatical Needle Knight Leda. This group included warriors of all backgrounds. Freya, a former soldier of Radahn, Ansbach, a loyalist to the Lord of Blood, and Mor, a simple and kind merchant. For the first half of the story, this group is united by a miraculous sense of peace and cooperation. Despite their conflicting histories and ideologies, they work together to clear the way for Miquella. However, this unity is revealed to be a total fabrication, a result of the massive mental charm Miquella had placed on them to ensure they would serve his pilgrimage. The breaking of Miquella's great rune acts as a catalyst for a charmed war among these followers. Once the mental compulsion is lifted, the group immediately begins to fracture along the lines of their original loyalties and personal beliefs. Ansbach, a man of profound honor, realizes with horror that Miquella had stolen the heart of his master Morg and used his body as a disposable vessel. Freya, on the other hand, decides to stay loyal to Miquella, not out of charm, but out of a desire to see her Lord Radahn resurrected. The followers are no longer a band of brothers. They are a collection of traumatized and angry individuals who must decide whose age they truly want to serve. Needle Knight Leda represents the most dangerous aspect of Miquella's influence. Even after the charm breaks, her love for Miquella remains so absolute that it turns into a murderous paranoia. She begins to view every other follower as a potential traitor, believing that she is the only pure servant of the kind god. She initiates a series of purges within the group, attempting to kill anyone she suspects of doubt. Leda proves that Miquella's influence doesn't just make people kind. It can make them into fanatics who are willing to commit any atrocity in the name of their god's compassion. She is the dark shadow of Miquella's army. The conflict among the followers is a microcosm of the world Miquella wants to build. It shows that peace and kindness can only be maintained as long as people are forced to agree. The second that free will is returned to the group, the old hatreds and the new betrayals lead to an inevitable, bloody confrontation. Miquella's followers were not healed by his presence. They were simply paused. By the time the player reaches the final climb of Enir-Ilim, the group has dissolved into a war of needles and blood, proving that Miquella's age of compassion was always a fragile illusion that could not survive the light of truth. Ultimately, The story of the followers is a tragedy of manipulation. They were all good people in their own way, seeking a better world. But they were used as pawns by a god who viewed their hearts as things to be stolen and reshaped. Ansbach's eventual rebellion against Miquella is a heroic act of human defiance, a refusal to be a charmed slave to a deity who has discarded his own humanity. The final battle against Leda and her remaining allies is a somber affair, a fight against people who are so lost in Miquella's dream that they can no longer see the nightmare it has become. The followers are the first victims of the kind god's new world. Part 19. The Rite of the Secret. Rite Scroll. Soul Transference. In the deepest archives of the Shadowkeep, the player discovers the secret Rite Scroll, a forbidden and clinical document that explains the mechanical requirements for Miquella's plan of resurrection. The scroll reveals a chilling law of divinity. A lord requires a vessel. This explains why Miquella was so obsessed with the body of Morg and the soul of Radahn. Miquella's plan was not a simple magical revival, but a complex, surgical soul transference. He needed to take the soul of his chosen consort and place it into a physically purified and prepared body to create a lord who would be powerful enough to stand at the side of a new god. The rite described in the scroll is a perversion of the natural cycle of death and rebirth. It bypasses the Erdtree and the proper burial system that the Golden Order relied on. Instead, it uses the power of the shadow to pull a soul back from the afterlife and graft it onto a new physical host. This process is deeply unalloyed by the greater will, but it is also deeply monstrous. It treats the bodies of demigods like spare parts for a machine. Miquella's use of Mohg's body, a body he had already purified of its agency through his charm, is the physical realization of this rite. He was a divine doctor performing a soul transplant on the world. This rite also explains the vow that Miquella made in his childhood. He knew from a young age that to start his new age, he would need a lord of absolute strength. He chose Radahn, the mightiest demigod, but Radahn's physical body was eventually destroyed by the Scarlet Rot and the Festival of Death. The secret Rite Scroll was Miquella's way of fixing this problem. It allowed him to bring Radahn back without the rot of his original body, using the virgin strength of Mohg's omen flesh as the new vessel. It was a plan that required the deaths of two brothers to create one perfect consort for the new god. The secret rite is the ultimate proof of Miquella's absolutism. He was so committed to his childhood promise that he was willing to perform necromancy on his own family. The scroll is a cold, clinical document that lacks any mention of love or respect. It is purely about the mechanics of power. It shows that Miquella had moved beyond the unalloyed gold of his youth and into a much darker, much more Marika-like form of magic. He was no longer trying to heal the world. He was trying to build a new world using the corpses of the old one. The rite is the backstage of Miquella's divinity, the bloody instructions for his age of compassion. Ultimately, the scroll serves as the evidence that the player needs to understand why Miquella must be stopped. It proves that Miquella's new world is built on the same sacrifice and exploitation as his mother's world. He is recycling his family members to fuel his ascension. By the time the player reaches the Gate of Divinity, the secret rite has been completed and the promised consort stands ready. But the rite has left behind a trail of blood and shadow that Miquella can never truly wash away. He is a god who was born from a scroll of forbidden rites, a deity whose compassion is built on a foundation of surgical necessity. Part 20. Miquella's compassion. The dark side of peace. Miquella's age of compassion is revealed to be a global, permanent version of his mental charm, a state of being where conflict is erased because free will is no longer possible. Miquella viewed choice and ambition as the root causes of all the world's suffering. He believed that as long as people had the ability to choose their own path, they would inevitably choose to hurt each other, just as the Hornsent and the Golden Order had done for centuries. His solution was to embrace the world and strip everyone of their agency, forcing them into a state of perpetual hollow kindness. His compassion was not an offer, but a mandatory condition of reality. The dark side of this peace is that it creates a world of mindless stability. In Miquella's age, there would be no more wars, no more betrayals, and no more genocides. But there would also be no more art, no more personal love, and no more individual identity. Everyone would be needle knights in their own minds, driven by an artificial devotion to a kind god. It is a vision of the world that Saint Trina described as a prison. Miquella believed he was being kind by taking away the burden of choice, but he was actually killing the human spirit to keep it safe. He was a god who wanted to turn the planet into a safe room where no one could ever leave. This vision makes Miquella as terrifyingly absolute as his mother, Marika, ever was. Marika used the sword to enforce her order, while Miquella intended to use the heart. But the result is the same, a world that must bow to the singular vision of a god. Miquella's compassion is a form of divine tyranny that masquerades as a blessing. He is the pure version of Marika, a deity who has discarded all vices only to become a machine of pure, impartial logic. He had become so obsessed with the end of suffering that he no longer cared about the means by which that end was achieved. He was a god of peace who was willing to erase the world to save it. The age of compassion also required the ultimate consort, Radahn, to act as the enforcer of this peace. Radahn, a man who loved war and struggle, was to be turned into the eternal guardian of a world where struggle was forbidden. It is a profound irony. Miquella took the mightiest warrior and intended to use him to stop all fighting forever. This resurrected Radahn was to be the shield for a god who didn't want anyone to ever draw a sword again. It shows that Miquella understood that kindness still requires strength to stay in power. He was building a golden age that was actually a gilded cage, guarded by a charmed hero. Ultimately, Miquella's compassion is the final sin of the demigods. It is the belief that one person knows what is best for everyone else. By the end of his pilgrimage, Miquella had become the very thing he sought to replace. He was a god of exclusion. He was excluding the human part of the world to protect the kind part. The player's fight against Miquella and Radahn is a fight for the right to suffer, the right to choose, and the right to be unalloyed by the charm of a god. Miquella's story ends with the realization that pure kindness is just as destructive as pure vengeance, and that the age of compassion was just a beautiful, lightless void. Part 21. The Finger's Mother. Metyr and the Great Betrayal. Metyr, Mother of Fingers, is revealed to be the original cosmic entity of the lands between, the very first shooting star to fall from the cosmos, predating even the Elden Beast. She is the biological and spiritual mother of all two fingers and finger readers in the world. For eons, it was believed that she was the antenna for the greater will, receiving divine instructions and passing them down to the gods and the priests of the Erdtree. However, the player discovers a devastating cosmic truth. Metyr was broken long ago. She has received no signals, no messages, and no will from the greater will for thousands of years. She is an abandoned mother, screaming into a silent void. This revelation completely dismantles the foundation of the Golden Order and the will of the gods. It means that every divine decree interpreted by the Two Fingers was a lie. Marika, Godfrey, and the priests were not following the instructions of a greater will, but the senile, gibberish ramblings of a broken cosmic entity who was desperately trying to reconnect with a creator who had already left. The great betrayal is not an act of a person, but an act of the universe itself. The greater will abandoned its daughter, Metyr, and Metyr in turn accidentally misled the entire world of the lands between through her own desperation. Metyr's physical form reflects this broken state. She is a massive, bloated, and unnatural mass of fingers and eyes, hidden away in a lightless birthing ground beneath the cathedral of Metyr. She is constantly giving birth to new, useless fingers that wander the ruins, searching for a sign that will never come. She is a creature of pure loneliness. Her greater will was never about order. It was about the simple, primal desire of a child to be heard by its parent. The Golden Order was built on a misunderstanding of this cosmic grief, turning a mother's scream into a king's law. The madness of Metyr also infected the finger readers and the high priests, like Count Ymir. They began to realize that the signals were erratic and nonsensical, leading to a culture of interpretation that was actually just guessing. The Two Fingers were not prophets. They were hollow shells of a cosmic connection that had already burnt out. This explains why the greater will is so silent throughout the games. It isn't testing humanity. It has simply left the building. Metyr is the discarded antenna of a god who moved on to another project, leaving the lands between to rot in a cycle of imaginary, divine will. Ultimately, Metyr is the mother of the lie. She is the proof that the order of the world was always a fabrication. By defeating her, the player is not just killing a boss, but cutting the cord to the ancient, broken past. Metyr's story is a reminder that in the world of Elden Ring, the gods are often just aliens who have been abandoned by their own outer gods. The greatest sin was not the shattering, but the original assumption that the fingers knew what they were talking about. Metyr is the tragic, bloated center of a rotten universe, a mother who was never told that her father had already forgotten her name. Part 22, Count Ymir, the madness of the high priests. Count Ymir sits upon his high throne in the cathedral of Metyr, acting as a chilling witness to the collapse of the religious structures of the lands between. He is a high priest who has spent his entire life studying the cosmos and the nature of the fingers, eventually reaching a conclusion that would shatter the faith of any gold-fearing citizen. Ymir believes that the Golden Order is rotten at the roots because the very fingers that guide it are flawed and broken. He openly mocks the fundamentalism of the capital, claiming that the high priests were simply blind men leading the blind. To Ymir, the tragedy of the world is that it has been governed by a maternal instinct that has gone completely insane. His madness is not the chaotic frenzy of the Three Fingers, but a cold and intellectual descent into cosmic despair. Ymir realized that Metyr, Mother of Fingers, was a broken antenna that had been abandoned by the greater will eons ago. This discovery drove him to a state of competitive maternalism, where he sought to replace Metyr and become a true Mother of Fingers himself. He began to practice strange, astronomical rituals, attempting to birth a new cosmic connection through his own physical and mental suffering. He viewed the existing two fingers as senile relics and believed that only through a new, pure mother could the world ever hope to hear the voice of the stars again. Ymir's quest serves as a grim proof that the religious leaders of the Erdtree were fully aware of their own isolation. They knew that their gods were no longer listening, which led to a cycle of desperate and increasingly horrific experiments to find a replacement. Ymir surrounded himself with finger creatures and star-lined magic, turning his cathedral into a laboratory of cosmic heresy. He represents the intellectual failure of the Golden Order, the moment when the scholars realized that their books were empty and their prayers were being sent to a dead number. He is a man who looked into the void and decided that the only way to survive was to become the void himself. The cathedral where he resides is a monument to this academic madness. It is filled with the sound of star calls and the scratching of fingerlings, creating an environment that feels disconnected from the warm grace of the Erdtree. Ymir spends his days rocking back and forth, cradling the seed of a new cosmic mother and mourning the loss of a parent he never actually knew. His story is a microcosm of the entire DLC's theme of abandonment. Just as Marika abandoned Messmer and Miquella abandoned Saint Trina, the Greater Will abandoned Metyr, leaving high priests like Ymir to try and piece together a meaning from the resulting silence. Ultimately, Count Ymir is a tragic figure who represents the endpoint of religious obsession. He was so desperate for a mother's guidance that he tried to evolve into one, losing his humanity and his sanity in the process. When the player finally confronts him, he is no longer a priest, but a vessel for a false cosmic birth. He is a reminder that the high priests of the lands between were often more dangerous than the monsters they preached against. Ymir's madness proves that the Golden Age was always a period of deep, quiet panic, where the men at the top were frantically trying to hide the fact that the heavens were completely empty. Part 23. The Crucible, the Primordial, Blending. The Land of Shadow is the hidden heart of the Crucible, the ancient and primordial state of reality, where all life once existed as a single chaotic mass. Before the separation brought about by the Golden Order, there was no distinction between human, beast, or plant. Everything was blended together in a red-gold current of pure energy. This era was defined by a violent and beautiful entwining of forms, where life was a constant process of merging and sprouting. The Land of Shadow is the place where this primordial energy was most concentrated, acting as the original forge for the great tree that predated the Erdtree we see today. The Hornsent civilization was built entirely upon the worship of this primordial blending. Their architecture, their fashion, and their very bodies were covered in images of spiraling horns and tangled limbs, reflecting their belief that the spiral was the sacred path of the Crucible. They did not see purity as a virtue. They saw the blending of many forms as the highest state of divinity. To a Hornsent, a person born with many horns or animalistic features was a blessed vessel of the original current. They sought to return the world to this state of chaotic unity, believing that the gate of divinity was the threshold through which the Crucible's power could be channeled to reshape the world. Queen Marika's Golden Order was a total and violent rejection of this primordial chaos. Her reign was based on the concept of order, which required life to be separated into neat, controlled, and pure categories. She sought to cut away the horns, the tails, and the feathers of the old world, labeling them as cursed or omens. By veiling the land of shadow, she was literally casting the crucible away from her perfect golden kingdom. She wanted a world of gold without the red of the original blending. This act of separation is what created the shadow in the first place, as the excluded energy of the crucible had to be deposited somewhere. The environment of the shadow realm is a physical testimony to this lost unity. You can see it in the tangled horns that grow from the earth and the warped flesh of the creatures that dwell there. The land of shadow is where the leftovers of the crucible's blending were hidden to rot. It is a place of high vitality but low order, where life continues to sprout in strange and aberrant ways, because it is no longer being pruned by the fingers of the Golden Order. It represents the raw material of existence, the bloody and chaotic clay that Marika used to build her throne before throwing the scraps into a lightless corner. The Crucible is the original state that Miquella also seeks to return to in his own way. By seeking an age of compassion where all are included, Miquella is attempting to recreate the blending of the Crucible through spiritual means. He wants to embrace the world just as the Crucible once did. The land of shadow is the graveyard of the first Crucible, but it is also the womb for Miquella's new vision. It is the place where the world's original sin of separation began, and it is the only place where the pieces of reality might finally be entwined once again, for better or for worse. Part 24. Bayle the Dread, the Great Dragon War. In the ancient history of the Shadow Realm, long before the Crusade of Messmer, a cataclysmic dragon war occurred that reshaped the hierarchy of the skies. This conflict was centered on Bayle the Dread, a primitive and violent dragon who dared to challenge the reigning dragon lord, Putrescence. Unlike the ancient dragons of the capital, who were noble and possessed 4 wings and stone scales, Bayle was a drake, a creature of raw, hot blood and jagged scales. Bayle represented a new, aberrant branch of dragon evolution that favored aggression and dread over the refined magic of the ancients. His challenge was an act of total blasphemy against the established draconic order. The battle between Bayle and Putrescence was one of the most violent events in the lore of the lands between. It was a clash of permanence versus evolution. The two titans tore into each other with such ferocity that the landscape of the jagged peak was permanently scarred. Bayle was nearly destroyed. He lost his legs, his wings were shredded, and his body was left as a mangled wreck of magma and scars. However, he managed to inflict an equal amount of damage on the Dragon Lord, tearing away 2 of Putrescence's heads and leaving him broken and waiting in the heart of the storm. Bayle fled to the heights of the jagged peak to nurse his wounds and bide his time. From his mountain throne, Bayle's dread blood began to seep into the land, giving birth to the lesser drakes and wyverns that we see throughout the world. These creatures are the degraded descendants of Bayle's lineage, lacking the stone immortality of the ancients, but possessing an insatiable hunger and a fire that burns with the heat of the earth's core. Bayle became a godlike figure to these lesser dragons, a broken king who represented the rage of the mortal world against the eternal world of the gods. He is a creature of pure, concentrated hatred, a dragon who refused to die and refused to submit to the old order. The jagged peak itself is a monument to Bayle's presence. It is a vertical wasteland of lightning storms and jagged rocks, where the very air is thick with the scent of dragon fire. Bayle sits at the summit, a mass of charred flesh and broken wings, fueled by a dread that allows him to manifest spectral limbs of magma. He is the antithesis of the sunlight of the gods. He represents the raw power of the Crucible's animal side, a being that exists outside the grace of the Erdtree and the laws of the Dragon Lord. He is the original rebel, the dragon who proved that even an eternal lord could be wounded. Bayle the Dread is a symbol of undying rage. He is a reminder that the world of Elden Ring is built on a foundation of extinct or broken legends. By the time the player reaches him, Bayle is a ruin of a dragon, but his power is still absolute within his domain. He is the father of the drakes, the one who stole the sky from the ancients and then burned it to ash. His story is a tragedy of ambition and evolution, showing that in the land of shadow, even the dragons were caught in a cycle of genocide and betrayal that mirrored the struggles of Marika and the Hornsent. Part 25. Igon's Revenge. The Drake Hunter. Igon is a broken and crippled warrior found screaming on the path to the jagged peak, and his story is one of the most memorable examples of human defiance in the entire game. Igon was once a drake hunter, a man who lived for the thrill of the hunt and the challenge of the dragons. However, his life was shattered when he encountered Bayle the Dread. The dragon did not just defeat Igon, it annihilated him, crushing his legs and leaving him to crawl through the ash as a broken husk of a man. But where most would find despair, Igon found a pure and obsessive hatred that would fuel his existence for decades. His revenge was not a noble quest, but a grimy and painful obsession. Igon spent his final years crafting harpoons, specifically designed to pierce the dread hide of Bayle. He lived in a state of perpetual agony, his mind focused entirely on the image of the dragon's shattered wings. He viewed himself as a flea that would eventually bring down a giant. Igon's rage was so intense that it transcended the limits of his physical body. He did not care about the Golden Order or the age of Miquella. He only cared about the sound of his harpoon sinking into Bayle's rotten flesh. When the player assists Igon and summons his spirit for the final battle against Bayle, we witness one of the most visceral performances in the game. Even as a ghost, Igon continues to scream his legendary curses at the dragon, his voice cracking with the weight of his hatred. He calls out, "Curse you, Bayle," with a ferocity that startles even the player. This is the soul of a man who refused to hollow because his hate was too strong to be extinguished. Igon represents the little man standing up to a cosmic horror, using nothing but his will and a big bolt of iron. The tragedy of Igon is that he had to die to achieve his goal. He spent his life in a ditch and his death on a battlefield. But to Igon, this was a fair trade. He achieved a sainthood of a different kind, a saint of vengeance. His harpoons remain as a testament to the fact that even a godlike monster like Bayle can be hunted by someone who has nothing left to lose. Igon is the human heart of the Jagged Peak, a blood-stained hero who reminds the player that in a world of divine schemes, sometimes the most pure thing is a simple, honest desire for revenge. Igon's story is a rejection of the compassion of Miquella. Igon did not want mercy or healing. He wanted justice delivered through a harpoon. He is a reminder that the world of Elden Ring is cruel, and that the only way to survive it is to find a reason to keep screaming. By the time Bayle falls, Igon's work is done, and his spirit can finally rest in the silence of the mountain. He is the Drake Hunter who proved that a broken man can still kill a dragon, and his legend is one of the few pure things left in the land of shadow. Part 26. Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame. The failed Lord. Deep within the Abyssal Woods, hidden away from the light of the Scadutree, lies Midra's manse, a place of eternal suffering and failed divinity. Midra was once a sage and a scholar who sought to understand and contain the influence of the frenzied flame, an outer god of chaos and despair. However, Midra was fundamentally too weak to become a true lord of chaos. He possessed the desire, but lacked the spiritual fortitude required to channel the flame without being consumed by it. He became a victim of the very power he tried to master, trapped in a state of perpetual, smouldering agony that lasted for centuries. The Hornsent inquisitors discovered Midra's heresy and subjected him to a holy torture. They drove a barbed spike through his head and torso, pinning his body to the architecture of his own home. This was meant to silence the flame within him, forcing him to endure the pain as a form of penance. Midra spent hundreds of years in this half-dead state, his manse becoming a graveyard of dust and madness. He was a failed lord in every sense of the word, a man who had invited a god into his house and then was punished by the world for his failure to be strong enough to host it. When the player finally arrives at the manse and challenges Midra, the dam finally breaks. Midra speaks his first words in eons, declaring that he will endure no more. This is the moment of his surrender. He pulls the barbed spike from his own body, a violent act of self-mutilation, and allows the frenzied flame to finally take control. His head explodes into a swirling orb of chaos fire, and he becomes the Lord of Frenzied Flame. This transformation is not a victory, but a total defeat of Midra's identity. He is no longer a man. He is a puppet for a god that wants to burn the world to nothingness. Midra's boss fight is a haunting display of chaos and instability. He moves with a twitchy, unnatural grace, his body melting and reforming as the flame consumes him. He represents the ultimate danger of the outer gods, the fact that they do not want lords, they want fuel. Midra was a good man who tried to do the right thing, but in the world of Elden Ring, good intentions are the primary fuel for the most horrific tragedies. His manse is a monument to the failure of human will against the infinite weight of cosmic madness. Ultimately, Midra's story is a warning to the player and to Miquella. It shows that trying to control or contain the primordial forces of the world will always lead to a spike in the head. Midra is the shadow of the Lord of Chaos ending from the base game, a failed version of the player's own potential. He is a figure of profound pity, a sage who became a monster because he could not stop the pain. When he is finally defeated, the frenzied flame is extinguished, and Midra is allowed to die at last. He is the Lord of Cinder of the Shadow Realm, a man who burned for a century and left behind nothing but ash. Part 27, Nanaya's Torch. The Tragedy of the Manse. The story of Midra cannot be understood without the presence of Nanaya, his devoted wife who stayed by his side through the darkest centuries of his torture. Nanaya was a witness to her husband's descent into heresy and his subsequent imprisonment by the Hornsent inquisitors, while the rest of the world abandoned Midra to his woods. Nanaya remained in the manse, acting as the anchor for his failing mind. She is a figure of tragic love, a woman who chose to share in a madness she did not deserve, because she could not bear to leave her husband alone in the dark. The Nanaya's torch item provides the heartbreaking details of their final years together. It reveals that as Midra was being pierced by the barbed spike, Nanaya held him in her arms and whispered for him to endure. This whisper was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was an act of pure compassion, giving Midra the strength to resist the frenzied flame and keep the world safe from his chaos. On the other hand, it was an act of unintentional cruelty, as it prolonged Midra's agony for eons. Her love was the chain that kept Midra pinned to his spike. Nanaya eventually passed away, leaving her torch and her final message behind. She is found as a corpse in the manse, still clutching the items that connected her to her husband. She represents the quiet tragedy of the Shadow Realm, the unseen sacrifices made by ordinary people in the shadow of divine disasters. Her love was powerful enough to hold back an outer god, but it was not enough to save the man she loved. She is the saint of the manse, a woman whose compassion was just as absolute and destructive as Miquella's own. The atmosphere of the manse is haunted by Nanaya's presence. You can feel her spirit in the dusty hallways and the faded portraits. She is the reason why the Abyssal Woods did not burn long ago. She was the human shield for the world. But her story also highlights the futility of endurance in a world of infinite suffering. By telling Midra to endure, she was asking him to do the impossible. When Midra finally surrenders to the flame after the player arrives, he is effectively betraying Nanaya's final wish, showing that even the purest love cannot forever withstand the weight of a barbed spike. Ultimately, Nanaya and Midra are a dark mirror of Marika and her consorts. They show that order and stability are always bought at the price of individual agony. Nanaya's torch is the light that failed, a symbol of human warmth that was eventually swallowed by the frenzied flame. Their story is a miniature masterpiece of Elden Ring's melancholy, a tale of a husband and wife who lost everything to a god they never wanted to meet. Nanaya is the silent heart of the Abyssal Woods, a flower that grew in the shadow of a chaos that eventually burned her to ash. Part 28, the Putrescence, the sludge of death in the stone. Coffin fissure, at the very bottom of the world, lies the Putrescence, a purple and ghostly sludge that represents the impurity of a broken death cycle. This substance is the byproduct of bodies that have been washed up in the land of shadow, but were denied a proper Erdtree burial. Without the roots of the Erdtree to recycle their souls, these remains began to stagnate and ferment in the dark, becoming a viscous and haunted liquid. The Putrescence is the garbage of the afterlife, a collection of unwanted memories and discarded flesh that has taken on a life of its own. This sludge eventually coalesced into the Putrescent Knight, a skeletal and ghastly guardian that serves as the protector of the stone coffin fissure. This knight is not a man, but a manifestation of the Putrescence itself, a living mound of death sludge that fights with a curved blade made of rotten bone. It represents the stagnation of the Shadow Realm. While the rest of the world is burning or blooming, the Putrescence is rotting. It is a stalled state of existence, where death has become permanent and physical, rather than a transition to a new life. The Putrescence is also deeply connected to the sleep of Saint Trina. The purple color of the sludge mirrors the deep sleep of the goddess, suggesting that the Putrescence is what happens to life when it sleeps for too long without waking up. It is the sediment of a dream. By guarding Saint Trina, the Putrescent Knight is protecting the only thing in the world that is as still and forgotten as the sludge itself. They are allies in abandonment. The Putrescence proves that Marika's order created a waste product of suffering that the gold could never cleanse. To the Hornsent, the Putrescence was a holy sign of the blending of many lives, but to the Golden Order, it was a horrific impurity. It is the antithesis of holy water. It is unclean, unstable, and haunted by the rancorous spirits of the forgotten. The fact that this substance is flammable and volatile shows that it is unnatural. It is energy that has nowhere to go. The putrescence is the clog in the sink of the universe, a physical proof that the cycle of life in the lands between is fundamentally broken at the bottom. Ultimately, the putrescence is the final resting place for those who were excluded from the grace. It is the mass grave of the Golden Order. By defeating the putrescent knight, the player is clearing away the stagnation of the past, but the sludge remains. It is a reminder that in the world of Elden Ring, death is never truly gone. It just changes shape. The putrescence is the purple shadow of the Golden Age, a rotting monument to the millions of lives that were washed away and forgotten, so that Marika could build her perfect world on the surface. Part 29. Romina, Saint of the Bud. The Rot's Origin. Romina, Saint of the Bud, stands as the final gatekeeper before the Tower of Enir-Ilim. Her story is a direct result of the trauma caused by Messmer's crusade. Romina was once a priestess of a minor church in the Land of Shadow. She lived in peace until the fire of the Golden Order arrived at her doorstep. Messmer's army burned her church. They slaughtered her companions. Romina was left alone in the smouldering ruins with nothing but her grief. In her absolute despair, she discovered a divine element hidden within the charred remains. It was a pink, budding flower that contained the power of the scarlet rot. She wove this rot into her own being. She transformed her sorrow into a new, pestilent form of life. The transformation of Romina was not a curse imposed upon her. It was a choice she made to survive a world of fire. She became a hybrid creature with the body of a massive centipede and the torso of a suffering woman. She represents the resilience of life in the Shadow Realm. She shows that even a horrific corruption can be viewed as a blessing when everything else has been taken away. Romina is the Saint of the Bud, a figure who found beauty in the rot and built a new sanctuary in the ancient ruins of Rauh. She is the reason the Scarlet Rot exists in the Land of Shadow. She acted as a bridge between the ancient pestilence and the modern era. Her role in the story is to act as the final barrier before Miquella reaches the gate of divinity. She guards the Church of the Bud. She protects the path that leads to the summit of the tower. Romina represents the chaos of the Crucible in its most biological and infectious form. Marika's order sought to burn away all impurity, but Romina embraced it. She is a reminder that the crusade did not purge the world. It simply forced the darkness to evolve into something even more dangerous. She is the patron of the pests and the kindred of rot. She is a mother to the things that flourish in the ruins of civilization. Romina also provides a critical link to the story of Malenia and Miquella. Her discovery of the Scarlet Rot in the Land of Shadow suggests that the Rot God has a much longer history in this world than previously believed. Miquella likely encountered Romina or her teachings during his pilgrimage. It led him to understand the true nature of the rot that was eating his sister. Romina is the shadow of Malenia. She is a woman who was consumed by the rot but found a way to use it as a shield. She is the final echo of the ancient ruins. She is a saint who was born from the ash of a crusade and the petals of a decaying flower. Romina is a symbol of the unintended consequences of Marika's vengeance. By trying to exterminate her enemies, Marika accidentally created a goddess of rot. Romina's existence proves that you cannot kill an idea with fire. The more Messmer burned, the more Romina bloomed. When the player finally defeats her, they are silencing the last guardian of the ruins. But they are also witnessing the tragic end of a survivor who just wanted to protect her bud. Romina's story is a dark flower growing in a field of ash. It is a testament to the fact that in the land of shadow, life will always find a way to bite back. Part 30. The Ancient Ruins of Rauh, the First Civilization. The ancient ruins of Rauh are the oldest structures in the land of shadow. They predate even the Hornsent and the arrival of the Erdtree. These massive stone viaducts and crumbling temples are filled with the kindred of rot and the pests that follow the Saint of the Bud. Rauh represents the primordial foundation of the world. It is a civilization that lived in harmony with the rot and the Crucible long before Marika was even a thought. The ruins are overgrown with ancient moss and thick red vines. It creates an environment that feels prehistoric and alien. This is the place where the cycle of rot and the cycle of life have been fighting for dominance for thousands of years. The architecture of Rauh is fundamentally different from the Gothic spires of the Golden Order or the spiraling towers of the Hornsent. It is built on a scale that suggests a much larger and more ancient race once ruled the skies. The ruins are filled with statues of long-forgotten deities and murals that depict a world of insects and budding flowers. This area proves that the lands between have undergone several total shifts in reality. The Golden Order is just the latest layer on top of a much deeper, more chaotic history. Rauh is the memory of the world's original biology. It is a place where the rules of life were still being written. In the lore of the Shadow Realm, Rauh serves as the refuge for those who were cast out by the Crusade. The kindred of rot fled to these ruins to worship Romina and protect the pink bud. It is a place of absolute biological density. The air is thick with spores and the sound of chittering wings. Miquella's path led him through these ruins because they are the physical gateway to the ancient world. To reach the gate of divinity, Miquella had to pass through the very first civilization. He had to acknowledge the roots of the world before he could attempt to change its future. Rauh is the basement of history. It is the place where the shadows are the longest. The ruins also highlight the futility of Marika's attempt to erase the past. Messmer's army could burn the cities of the Hornsent, but they could not destroy the stone of Rauh. The ancient ruins remained. They were silent and indifferent to the crusade. They represent the permanence of the earth itself. It is a structure that outlasts every god and every age. Rauh is the proof that the scarlet rot is not a new infection. It is an ancient, dormant force that has always been part of the world. It is the shadow of the Erdtree's roots. It is a place where the gold has no power, and where the ancient cycle of decay continues uninterrupted. Ultimately, the ancient ruins of Rauh are the final verdict on the history of the Shadow Realm. They show that the struggle for divinity is a recurring nightmare. The people of Rauh had their gods. The Hornsent had theirs. Marika has hers. Each age believes it is the final and perfect order, yet they all end up as moss-covered stones in a lightless valley. Rauh is the graveyard of civilizations. It makes the ambitions of Miquella and the vengeance of Marika seem like brief, insignificant flickers of light. It is the original shadow. It is the place where the first bud bloomed and where the last god will eventually fall. Part 31. The Vow, the Childhood Promise. Miquella's entire world-altering plan hinges on a childhood vow made in the golden halls of the capital. Long before the shattering and the pilgrimage into the shadow, Miquella made a promise to Radahn, the mightiest demigod and the master of the stars. If Miquella were to become a god, Radahn would be his promised consort. He would be the eternal general and the lord who would enforce his new age of compassion. This vow was the singular focus of Miquella's life. It was a promise that he carried with him, even as he discarded his flesh and his heart. He chose Radahn because he saw in his brother a perfect combination of martial strength and innate kindness. The nature of this vow is deeply debated. Some believe it was a mutual pact made in a moment of childhood innocence. Others suspect that Miquella's charm was already at work even then. Regardless of its origin, the vow became the legal and spiritual foundation for Miquella's new order. He did not want the throne for himself alone. He wanted a lord who could stand as the shield for his compassion. Radahn, a man who worshipped the strength of Godfrey and the leonine spirit of battle, was the only one Miquella deemed worthy of this role. The vow was a contract written in the blood of demigods. It was a promise that death itself would not be allowed to break. This childhood promise recontextualizes every action Radahn and Malenia took during the Shattering. They were not fighting for great runes or territory. They were fighting to fulfill the terms of the vow. Miquella's pilgrimage was the final stage of this agreement. He entered the land of shadow specifically to reach the gate of divinity so he could fulfill his end of the bargain. He believed that by making Radahn his consort, he could create a world where strength was used only for kindness, and where the chaos of the Crucible was finally tamed. The vow was the light that guided Miquella through the darkness of the Shadow Realm. It was a dream of a reunited family. However, the vow also required a terrible price. For Radahn to become a consort in the land of shadow, his physical body in the lands between had to die. This led to the horrific stalemate in Caelid. The mightiest demigods clashed in a battle that ruined an entire continent. The vow was a death sentence for millions of soldiers and a curse for the land itself. Miquella's childhood promise was the spark that ignited the most violent war in history. It proved that even the most innocent desire of a god can lead to absolute catastrophe. The vow was the chain that bound Radahn to Miquella's destiny. It was a bond that the player finally encounters at the peak of Enir-Ilim. The vow is the heart of Miquella's tragedy. He was a boy who loved his brother so much that he was willing to destroy the world to bring him back. He believed that their partnership could fix the broken world Marika had left behind. But by the time the vow was fulfilled, Miquella was no longer the boy who made it. He had discarded his heart and his doubts. He left behind only the cold, divine will to see the promise through. The vow remained, but the love that inspired it had been thrown into a stone coffin. It was a promise made by a child and kept by a monster. It was a childhood vow that became a global nightmare. Part 32, The Battle of Caelid, recontextualized. The legendary battle between Malenia, Blade of Miquella, and Star Scourge Radahn was always portrayed as a struggle for dominance during the Shattering. However, the pilgrimage into the shadow recontextualizes this conflict. It was a targeted assassination mission with a divine purpose. Malenia did not march her army across the continent to claim Radahn's great rune or his territory in Caelid. She was sent by Miquella to kill Radahn's physical body. She had to free his soul so it could be sent to the land of shadow. The battle was a ritual of liberation. It was a violent necessity to ensure that Radahn could fulfill his role as the promised consort at the gate of divinity. This explains why Malenia was willing to unleash the Scarlet Rot and ruin the entire region. She was under orders to ensure Radahn died at any cost. When she finally locked blades with him and whispered in his ear, her words were not a taunt. They were a signal. Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort. She was telling him that the time for his physical life had ended, and the time for his divine service had begun. The battle was a desperate, bloody attempt to force the fulfillment of the childhood vow. Malenia was acting as the executioner for Miquella's plan. She sacrificed her own dignity and her army to send Radahn's soul into the shadow. The tragedy of this battle is that Radahn did not die as intended. He was corrupted by the rot, but remained alive in a state of mindless, cannibalistic frenzy. This stalled Miquella's plan for centuries. The Radahn festival was the final act of the mission Malenia had started. Only after the player defeats Radahn can his soul finally migrate to the land of shadow. This means that the player was an unintentional pawn in Miquella's game. You did the one thing Malenia could not finish. The Battle of Caelid was a massive, continental-scale preparatory ritual for the resurrection we see at the end of the pilgrimage. It also highlights the ruthlessness of the twin prodigies. To fulfill a promise, they were willing to turn an entire kingdom into a rotting wasteland. Malenia's loyalty to Miquella was so absolute that she was willing to become the very thing she hated. She became a goddess of rot just to kill the man Miquella wanted as his consort. The Battle of Caelid was not a war of kings. It was a war of vessels. It was about harvesting a soul. This revelation makes the ruins of Caelid feel even more somber. They are the remains of a failed assassination attempt that was only meant to serve the personal ambition of a hidden god. The recontextualization of the Battle of Caelid proves that Miquella was the puppet master of the shattering from the beginning. He used his sister as a weapon and his brother as a target. The struggle between the two strongest demigods was just a prerequisite for Miquella's Age of Compassion. By the time the soul of Radahn reaches the Shadow Realm, it has been refined by the fires of war and the rot of Caelid. It is ready to be placed into its new vessel. The battle was the bloody opening act for the final tragedy at the Gate of Divinity. It was a conflict that proved Miquella's kindness was bought with the destruction of an entire world. Part 33. Radahn, consort of Miquella, the resurrection. At the peak of Enir-Ilim, Miquella finally succeeds in his grand ritual. He brings back the soul of Radahn to serve as his promised consort. However, the Radahn we fight is not the same man who mastered the stars in the lands between. He is a resurrected entity. His soul was placed into the surgically prepared and purified body of Morg, the Lord of Blood. This is evident in his appearance. He possesses Radahn's iconic armor and gravity magic, but he also uses blood flame attacks. He has small, budding horns on his gauntlets. He is a monster made from the remains of the demigods. He is a hybrid being designed to be the ultimate protector of Miquella's new age. This version of Radahn is the perfect vessel for Miquella's vision. He has the martial strength and tactical brilliance of the Star Scourge, but he is also tied to the primordial power of the Crucible through Mog's omen flesh. He is a lord who bridges the gap between the Golden Order and the Ancient Shadow. Miquella's plan was to create a consort who was unalloyed by the greater will, but possessed all the strength of the past. Promised consort Radahn is the physical manifestation of the vow made in childhood. He is a warrior brought back from the dead to enforce a world of peace through the sheer weight of his blades. The resurrection is a profound violation of Radahn's agency, while the story suggests he may have agreed to the vow as a child. The man we fight in the Shadow Realm is a silent, obedient shadow of his former self. He does not speak. He does not roar. He does not show the leonine personality he was known for. He is a puppet of the new god. He is a consort who exists only to serve Miquella's will. This is the dark side of Miquella's compassion. He was willing to desecrate the bodies of two of his brothers to create one perfect husband. Radahn is the gilded guardian of a world that has no room for his own free will. In combat, this Radahn is terrifyingly fast and powerful. He represents the peak of demigod strength. He combines gravity magic with holy light and blood flame. It is a combination of powers that no single being was ever meant to possess. He is the true Elden Lord of Miquella's age. He is a being that makes the player's own journey seem small by comparison. Miquella hitches a ride on Radahn's back during the fight. He whispers into his ear and guides his strikes. They are a single unit of divine authority. They are a god and a lord entwined in a bond of forced love and absolute power. Ultimately, the resurrection of Radahn is the final sin of Miquella. It is the moment he becomes exactly like his mother, Marika. He has used his family as tools. He has manipulated the laws of life and death. He has built a throne on a foundation of corpses. Radahn is a tragic figure. He is the mightiest warrior in history, reduced to a silent bodyguard for a boy who has lost his heart. The fight against him is a struggle against the very idea of a perfect lord. As Radahn falls for the final time, the dream of the age of compassion dies with him. It leaves the world to find a path that is not built on the stolen bodies of the dead. Part 34, the final battle at Enir-Ilim. The final battle at the Gate of Divinity is the climax of the entire Elden Ring saga. It is a clash between two prospective fates for the world. On one side is the player, the tarnished who has clawed their way through the lands between to become Elden Lord under the old laws. On the other side is Miquella, the kind. He has ascended to godhood and stands with his promised consort, Radahn. This is not a fight over territory. It is a fight for the soul of the world. Miquella intends to embrace the planet and strip away the free will of every living being to ensure an end to conflict. The player represents the continuation of the world's messy but free existence. During the battle, Miquella uses his divine power to attempt to charm the player directly. His grab attack is a literal attempt to steal the player's heart and force them into his new age. He whispers a promise of a 1,000-year voyage guided by compassion. If the player is caught twice, they lose the fight. It is not through death, but through submission. This mechanic perfectly illustrates the danger of Miquella's divinity. He does not want to kill you. He wants to own you. He is a god who wins by taking away your ability to fight back. The fight is a struggle to maintain your own agency against the overwhelming weight of divine love. The arena at the peak of Enir-Ilim is a stark, ashen landscape. It is surrounded by the petrified bodies of the Gate of Divinity. It is a place where the shadow and the gold finally meet. As Radahn unleashes strikes of light and gravity, Miquella illuminates the sky with holy pillars of flame. It is the most divine combat in the game. It is a spectacle of power that shows what happens when an Empyrean truly achieves godhood. But beneath the light, the fight is a desperate trade. Miquella is trading the world's freedom for the world's safety. He is the ultimate safety god. The player is the ultimate chaos factor. The presence of Radahn in this fight is the final obstacle. He is the shield of Miquella, a wall of muscle and magic that refuses to break. Defeating him requires the player to overcome the strongest warrior in history while resisting the mental pull of a god. When Miquella clings to Radahn's back, they represent the perfect union that Marika and Radahn failed to achieve. They are the totality that Miquella's father always sought. But it is a totality built on the stolen soul of Radahn and the discarded heart of Saint Trina. It is a beautiful, light-filled lie that the player must shatter with cold, hard steel. The battle at Enir-Ilim is the final verdict on Miquella's pilgrimage. As he and Radahn fall, Miquella's final words are a soft, tragic apology to his consort. He realized too late that you cannot force a world to be kind. The age of compassion ends before it can even begin. It leaves the gate of divinity as a silent, bloody monument to a failed dream. The player stands alone at the top of the tower. You have killed the most kind being in existence to ensure that the world can continue to make its own mistakes. The battle was the end of the shadow and the gold. It leaves only the tarnished to decide what comes next. Part 35, Final Verdict, The Tragic Cycle. The ending of Shadow of the Erdtree provides the final, devastating verdict on Miquella and the nature of divinity in Elden Ring. Miquella, despite his beauty and his noble goals, is revealed to be exactly like his mother, Marika. In his quest to fix the broken world she left behind, he committed every single one of her sins. He abandoned his followers. He used his family as disposable tools. He intended to impose his singular will upon the entire planet. Miquella's story is a profound tragedy. It proves the pursuit of godhood in this world always leads to the sacrifice of one's humanity. To become a god is to become a monster of absolute will. The age of compassion was never a real solution. It was just a different kind of cage. While Marika's age was built on exclusion and vengeance, Miquella's age was to be built on compulsion and stolen hearts. Both ages required a shadow to exist. Marika hid her shadow in the Veiled Realm. Miquella hid his shadow by discarding Saint Trina and his own capacity for doubt. Miquella's tragedy is that he thought he was unalloying the world, but he was actually just recycling the same patterns of tyranny. He was a boy who wanted to be better than his mother, but he ended up becoming her final, most perfect reflection. The final verdict on Miquella is one of profound pity. He was a genius child who truly believed he could save everyone. His love for Malenia and his desire to help the misbegotten were genuine, but they were warped by the poison of love that comes with divine power. He became so focused on the goal that he lost sight of the people he was trying to save. He turned his brother Radahn into a puppet, and his brother Morg into a suit of skin. Miquella is the ultimate warning that even the most pure intentions can lead to the most abyssal atrocities if they are not tempered by a human heart. His death at the hands of the player is the only possible mercy. By stopping Miquella, the player is preventing the world from falling into a state of mindless, charmed peace. It is a rejection of the kind God in favor of the messy human. Miquella's story ends in the ash of Enir-Ilim. It is final proof that the cycle of the lands between is inescapable. Every new age begins with a sacrifice at the gate of divinity. Every new god believes they are the one who will finally fix everything. Miquella was just the latest dreamer to be consumed by the first sin of his mother. The land of shadow remains as it always was, a graveyard of divine ambitions. As the player leaves the tower and looks back at the Scadutree, the lesson of Miquella is clear. Divinity is a prison, and the age of compassion was just another wall. The story of Elden Ring is not about becoming a god, but about the cost of trying. Miquella the Kind was the most beautiful failure in history. He was a boy who gave up his soul to save the world and ended up losing both. He is the shadow of the Erdtree. He is a memory of a kindness that was too heavy for the world to bear.